The rain pounded on the windshield as Marcus adjusted his rearview mirror, glancing at the faded silhouette of the Ashwood Asylum in the distance. The building loomed like a rotting corpse against the night sky, its Gothic spires clawing at the heavens. The car's engine stuttered as he pulled up to the main gate, a rusted monstrosity that groaned open as if compelled by unseen hands. He was here to film a documentary, a passion project, he told himself. But deep down, Marcus knew it was the stories of the asylum that had drawn him like a moth to a flame. Ashwood had been closed for decades, shrouded in scandal and infamy. Patients had vanished, staff had died in inexplicable circumstances, and rumors of brutal experiments whispered through the corridors of the town like an unshakable curse. Marcus had heard tales of shadowy figures roaming its halls, doors slamming shut with no one near, and the cries of tortured souls echoing long after the building had been abandoned. He had come prepared, cameras, recorders, and a stack of notes from amateur ghost hunters who had dared to enter before him, none of whom had ever stayed the night. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Marcus clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and graffiti scrawled by vandals over the years. His boots crunched against broken glass and debris as he made his way to the main hall, a cavernous space filled with rows of rusting gurneys. A broken wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels eerily still despite the draft that howled through the shattered windows. He set up his equipment, the flickering red light of the camera casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. "Night 1, he said into the microphone, his voice trembling slightly. "Exploring the first floor, reports of footsteps and voices." His words felt heavy, almost sacrilegious in the silence. The first hour passed uneventfully as Marcus wandered the halls. He spoke into the camera, recounting the asylum's history, pausing occasionally to listen. The quiet was oppressive, but nothing happened. Just as he began to feel foolish, a faint scraping sound reached his ears. He froze, his flashlight darting to the end of the hallway. The sound grew louder, like metal against stone, and a chill ran down his spine. "Hello?" His voice echoed, weak and uncertain. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It came from nowhere, and everywhere at once, wrapping around him like a cold wind. Heart-pounding, Marcus followed the sound, turning into a narrow corridor lined with doors, each marked with a rusted number. The whispers grew louder, words indistinct but filled with malice. The flashlight flickered, as if protesting his decision to continue. Room 218. The door was slightly ajar, and the whispers seemed to emanate from within. Summoning his courage, Marcus pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single bed frame, its mattress rotted away. The air felt colder here, biting at his skin despite his jacket. He stepped inside, camera in hand, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. "Jesus Christ!" Marcus spun around, yanking at the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers rose to a crescendo, then stopped, replaced by silence so profound it pressed against his eardrums. And then, faintly, came the sound of laughter. A child's laughter. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he turned back to the room. A figure stood in the corner, a child no older than 6, her face obscured by matted hair. She wore a hospital gown, its fabric yellowed and torn, and her bare feet left no prints on the dusty floor. Marcus froze, unable to speak or move. The child's head tilted, and she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. When the light returned, the girl was gone, but the laughter persisted, echoing down the hall. The door creaked open on its own, and Marcus bolted, his heart pounding like a war drum. He spent the next hour in the main hall, trying to convince himself he had imagined it. The camera battery was dead, though he'd charged it fully before arriving. Even stranger, when he played back the footage on his backup, the child's voice came through clearly. "You shouldn't be here." Determined to leave, Marcus packed his things and headed for the exit, but the door was gone. Where the entrance had been was now a solid wall, the bricks ancient and crumbling. Panic set in as he retraced his steps, but the building seemed to shift around him. Hallways led to dead ends, staircases spiraled into nothingness. It was as if Ashwood had become a living maze, trapping him within its rotting heart. The second floor was worse. The temperature plummeted as he climbed the stairs, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. He heard footsteps behind him, deliberate and heavy, but when he turned, no one was there. Doors slammed open and shut in a maddening rhythm, and once He swore he saw faces pressed against the windows, their mouths open in silent screams. In one room, he found an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries were scrawled in a frantic hand describing experiments performed on patients. Isolation chambers, prolonged darkness, screams won't stop. Marcus felt sick as he read. The final entry chilled him to the bone. They are still here. They won't let us leave. Pray you never see their eyes. A loud crash shattered his thoughts, and he spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a nurse, her uniform pristine despite the grime that coated everything else. Her face was obscured by a surgical mask, but her eyes, they were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to suck the light from the room. She stepped forward and Marcus stumbled back, tripping over debris. His flashlight rolled away, plunging him into darkness. He scrambled for it, but cold, bony fingers wrapped around his wrist. The nurse's grip was unyielding, and he felt himself being dragged down the hall. He screamed, kicking and thrashing, and suddenly, the grip was gone. Marcus lay on the floor, gasping for air. The flashlight flickered to life, revealing the empty corridor. His wrist throbbed where the nurse had grabbed him, and when he looked, bruises in the shape of fingers marred his skin. He ran. He didn't care where. He just needed to get away. The walls seemed to close in around him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Faces appeared in the cracks of the plaster, mouths chanting in unison, "You can't leave. You're one of us now." Exhausted and terrified, Marcus collapsed in what appeared to be the operating theater. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered across the floor, and a broken table stood at the center. He could hear his heart pounding, drowning out the whispers. But then the chanting returned, accompanied by the sound of approaching footsteps. The doors burst open, and figures flooded in. Patients in tattered gowns, nurses with hollow eyes, and doctors wielding bloodied instruments. They surrounded him, their expressions vacant but filled with a malevolent hunger. Marcus screamed as they descended upon him, their cold hands dragging him onto the table. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was the child, standing in the corner, her lips curling into a smile. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice sweet and mocking. Days later, the police found his car abandoned outside the asylum, its doors wide open. Inside Ashwood, there was no trace of Marcus, only his camera. When they played the footage, it ended with a single frame. The child's face, her hollow eyes staring into the lens. She was smiling. The winter wind howled as Olivia parked her car at the bottom of the hill, staring up at the imposing silhouette of Blackthorn Hospital. The sprawling building, abandoned for decades, loomed like a slumbering beast, its shattered windows resembling hollow eyes. Local legends called it the hospital that never sleeps, and for good reason. Ghostly apparitions, sudden screams, and the feeling of being watched were just a few of the horrors whispered about in hushed tones. Olivia wasn't here to ghost hunt, though. She was a nurse tasked with cataloging the leftover medical supplies before the property was demolished. The inside was worse than she expected. The stale air reeked of rot and mold, and the fluorescent lights flickered weakly when she powered them on. Her footsteps echoed eerily in the cavernous hallways, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The faint hum of the electricity did little to dispel the oppressive silence. Armed with a clipboard and flashlight, Olivia made her way through the first-floor storage rooms. Each room was a snapshot of decay. Rusted gurneys, shattered IV stands, and cabinets with their glass doors smashed in. As she marked items on her list, the sound of faint murmuring caught her attention. She froze, her pen hovering over the page. The murmurs grew louder, then faded just as quickly. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The echo was her only reply. She shook it off, convincing herself it was the wind. But as the hours wore on, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. It was subtle at first, a shiver down her spine, the hairs on her arms standing on end. Then she began seeing things, a shadow darting around the corner, a face in the glass of a broken cabinet, gone when she turned. The worst was when she reached the third floor. Blackthorn's psychiatric wing had been infamous for its cruelty. Patients were restrained for days, subjected to inhumane treatments that were later deemed experiments in disguise. The entire wing had been sealed off after a massive fire in 1973, killed nearly all the patients and staff on that floor. The charred walls bore evidence of the flames, blackened and crumbling, and the smell of burned wood lingered even after all these years. As Olivia walked down the hall, she passed an old nurse's station. The desk was overturned, papers scattered everywhere, yet one piece of paper caught her eye. It was pristine, as if freshly written, and it read, "Get out while you can." Her heart pounded as she dropped the paper and stepped back. The flashlight flickered. A loud crash sounded from a nearby room, and the door creaked open on its own. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Olivia approached the room. Inside was a padded cell, its walls scorched and peeling. The temperature dropped sharply as she stepped inside, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. "Don't stay too long," a voice whispered in her ear. She spun around, but no one was there. The door slammed shut behind her, and the flashlight died, plunging her into absolute darkness. Her panic rose as she fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and incoherent, filling the room like a swarm of locusts. "Help me," one voice pleaded. "Leave while you can," another hissed. "They'll take you too," a third moaned. Something brushed against her arm, icy and wet. She screamed, kicking at the door until it burst open. She stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, only to find the corridor entirely different. The once damaged walls were now pristine, the floor gleaming with polish. Hospital staff bustled about, their faces blurred as though she were seeing them through frosted glass. "Code Blue, room 302, a disembodied voice called. Nurses and doctors rushed past her, oblivious to her presence. The nameplates on the doors flickered, the letters rearranging themselves before her eyes. Then she noticed her name, Olivia Turner, patient for 487. No, she stammered, backing away. Her surroundings melted, the pristine hospital transforming back into the rotting husk it had been moments before. But the nameplate remained, her name etched into the metal as if it had always been there. A cold hand gripped her shoulder. She turned, coming face to face with a man in a doctor's coat. His eyes were pitch black, his smile unnaturally wide. "You've been here before," he said, his voice a guttural growl. "Welcome home." Olivia bolted, sprinting blindly through the hallways, which seemed to twist and shift around her. She turned corners that led nowhere, ran down stairs that looped back to the same floor. The building was alive, toying with her, trapping her deeper within its confines. She burst into the basement, a labyrinth of pipes and machinery that dripped with rust and condensation. The sound of distant sobbing filled the air, and she followed it, drawn against her will. The sobbing led her to the morgue. The body drawers were open, some empty, others filled with corpses that twitched and writhed as though trying to escape. Her flashlight flickered back on, illuminating a nameplate on the nearest slab. Turner, Olivia. The body bag unzipped itself slowly, revealing her own lifeless face staring back at her, eyes wide with terror. She screamed, stumbling backward, and the room erupted into chaos. The corpses rose from their slabs, their broken limbs dragging them toward her. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, as though the spirits themselves were in agony. "You can't leave. Stay with us. It's your turn now." Just as the cold hands of the dead closed around her, she awoke on the hospital floor, her clipboard lying next to her. The flashlight was still in her hand, its beam steady. For a moment she thought it had all been a nightmare, but when she checked her wrist, she saw the bruises. Fingerprints, deep and purple. She fled the hospital, abandoning her task and leaving everything behind. As she reached her car, she glanced back one last time. A figure stood in the window, watching her. It was herself, smiling, eyes black as the void. That night, Olivia dreamt of Blackthorn. She wandered its halls endlessly, her reflection in every surface whispering the same words, "You'll be back." When the demolition crew arrived the next day, they found no trace of her. Only her car remained, parked at the bottom of the hill, U-Bury keys still in the ignition. The howling wind pushed against Thomas as he stepped out of his truck, the beam from his flashlight cutting through the thick mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. Ravenwood Asylum stood before him, its decaying facade towering into the night sky. Once a state-of-the-art mental health facility, it had been abandoned in the 1950s under a cloud of controversy. Stories of inhumane treatments, patient deaths, and unexplained disappearances had turned the building into a local legend, a place best avoided. Thomas was no stranger to haunted locations. As a paranormal investigator, he prided himself on debunking myths and exposing the mundane truths behind eerie tales. But something about Ravenwood felt wrong. Even before he stepped inside, the air seemed heavier, as if the asylum exhaled dread into the night. The main entrance door creaked on rusted hinges as he pushed it open. The scent of mildew and rot hit him immediately, accompanied by the faint metallic tang of something he couldn't place. Inside, the foyer was a ruin of shattered tiles, crumbling walls, and graffiti scrawled by thrill-seekers. His boots echoed loudly as he moved toward the central staircase, the light from his flashlight sweeping over faded murals of serene pastoral landscapes, painted, ironically, to calm the patients. Setting up his equipment in what had once been the administration office, Thomas began his standard routine. Cameras, motion detectors, and EVP recorders were placed strategically around the building. He spoke into his handheld recorder, documenting his actions and observations. The air's colder than expected for this time of year. No visible drafts so far. Beginning EVP session. He paused, listening. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of his recorder. Then, faintly, he heard it. A shuffle, like footsteps dragging across the floor above him. His heart quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Is there anyone here with me?" he asked aloud. His voice echoed through the building. A beat of silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. 3 distinct knocks, directly above him. Thomas froze. He checked his watch. It was just after midnight. Most of the stories about Ravenwood mentioned activity peaking between midnight and 3 a.m. Steeling himself, he climbed the grand staircase, its once beautiful banister now warped and broken. The second floor was a maze of patient rooms, their doors hanging ajar like gaping mouths. The air grew colder with each step he took. In the far corner of the hallway, he found a door labeled Ward C in peeling paint. Pushing it open revealed rows of beds, their metal frames rusted and mattresses long gone. He walked slowly, his flashlight revealing faint scratches on the walls. Leaning closer, he realized they weren't random marks, but words etched by desperate hands. "Help me. They watch. Don't trust them." As he stood frozen, the temperature dropped suddenly and his breath became visible in the flashlight's beam. He swung the light around and gasped. At the far end of the room stood a figure, barely illuminated. It was a woman in a hospital gown, like her hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. Her head tilted unnaturally, as if trying to study him, and her arms dangled limply by her sides. "Hello?" Thomas called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. He took a hesitant step forward, but as the beam of light shifted slightly, the woman disappeared. Thomas blinked, the panic rising in his chest. He backed out of the room, his flashlight shaking as he scanned the hallway for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming echoed from the other end of the corridor. He turned and saw a single door, room 413, shut tight. That door had been open when he passed it earlier. Swallowing his fear, he moved toward it. The plaque on the door read, "Observation Room." Pushing it open revealed a large space with a shattered observation window looking into another room. Inside, Thomas saw rows of leather restraints bolted to the floor, some still holding rotted fragments of fabric. The walls were covered in more scratches, but these were different. Long, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by claws. His EVP recorder crackled suddenly, emitting a garbled sound that sent chills down his spine. He played back the recording. Among the static, a voice whispered faintly, "Get out!" "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. The air shifted, growing heavier, oppressive. From behind him came the sound of a slow, deliberate scrape, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. He turned sharply, his flashlight revealing nothing. But when he looked back at the observation window, his blood ran cold. Reflected in the glass was not his own face, but the woman from Ward C, standing directly behind him. Her mouth stretched wide in a soundless scream, her jaw unhinging far beyond what should have been possible. Thomas spun around, but the room was empty. He didn't remember running. All he knew was that he found himself back in the main hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Grabbing his camera equipment, he made for the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard he pulled or shoved, it remained locked. And then the laughter started. It was faint at first, a child's giggle coming from somewhere deep within the asylum, but it grew louder, more manic, until it echoed from every corner. Thomas pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound was relentless, drilling into his skull. "Let me out!" he screamed, pounding on the door. The laughter stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, he heard something worse. A soft, wet whisper right next to his ear. "You're staying." The lights flickered violently, plunging the asylum into darkness. His flashlight refused to turn back on. He felt the air shift again, as though something large and unseen moved past him. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, and then cold hands gripped his shoulders. The last thing Thomas saw before blacking out was the woman's face, inches from his own, her hollow eyes boring into him. 2 weeks later, a search team found Thomas's truck outside Ravenwood. Inside the asylum, they discovered his equipment scattered across various rooms, but no sign of Thomas himself. The only clue was his EVP recorder, still running on its last scraps of battery. When they played it back, there was one chilling message spoken in Thomas's voice. "Don't come looking for me. It won't let you leave." The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the sprawling grounds of Gravenhurst Sanitarium. Long abandoned, the building was a crumbling relic, its towering spires and ivy-covered walls whispering of forgotten atrocities. Legend had it that the sanitarium was cursed, its halls haunted by the tortured souls of patients who had never left. For decades, locals avoided it, warning that the ones who ventured inside often didn't return, or if they did, they were never the same. Tonight, Elena and her friends had decided to test the legend. Armed with flashlights and smartphones, they laughed nervously as they pushed open the massive iron gates and made their way toward the entrance. Elena had always been skeptical of ghost stories, convinced they were nothing more than the result of overactive imaginations. But even she couldn't shake the unease that settled over her as they stepped inside. The interior was a labyrinth of decay. The floors were warped, walls peeled with faded paint, and the air was damp and suffocating. Broken gurneys and rusted wheelchairs littered the corridors. The faint smell of antiseptic mingled with something fouler, something rotten. As they walked, their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the building were amplifying the sound. "Let's split up," suggested Marcus, always the thrill-seeker. "We'll cover more ground that way." Elena hesitated, but peer pressure won out. The group divided, agreeing to meet back in the main hall in an hour. Elena found herself paired with Lisa, the most cautious of the group. They ventured down a long hallway marked Ward 5. "This place gives me the creeps," Lisa whispered, her flashlight shaking. Elena forced a laugh. "It's just an old building, nothing to be scared of." But even as she said it, a sense of dread crept over her. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows growing darker with each step. At the end of the corridor, they found a room labeled Therapy Suite, Electroshock. Curiosity won out over fear, and they stepped inside. The room was a grotesque time capsule. A rusted electroshock therapy machine sat in the center, its wires trailing like dead vines. Straps hung loosely from a cracked leather chair, and the walls were covered in strange symbols scratched into the paint. Elena felt a chill as she ran her fingers over one of the carvings. It was crude, almost primal, and filled her with a sense of unease. "What do you think it means?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Elena could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breaths became visible, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. Then came the sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed down the hallway, growing louder, closer. The girls froze, their eyes wide. "Is that Marcus?" Lisa stammered, her voice trembling. Elena shook her head. The sound wasn't footsteps, it was something sharper, like nails clicking against the tiles. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from the darkness, came a whisper, soft, raspy, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight flickered, and for a split second Elena saw it, a figure crouched in the corner, its limbs twisted and elongated, its face hidden by a tangle of matted hair. Its head jerked toward them, and two hollow eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Run!" Elena screamed, grabbing Lisa's arm. They bolted from the room, the sound of the creature's clicking nails echoing behind them. The hallway seemed to shift as they ran, twisting and warping like a funhouse. Doors that had been open were now slam-shammed shut, and the familiar path to the main hall was gone. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. "We have to find the others!" Lisa cried, tears streaming down her face. Elena tried to calm her, but her own fear was overwhelming. She felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows reaching for her. A door to their left creaked open slowly, and a faint light spilled out. Desperate, they ran toward it, slamming the door shut behind them. The room was a patient dormitory, rows of metal bed frames covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught their attention was the writing on the walls. Thousands of words scrawled in blood-red ink. Some were pleas for help, others nonsensical ramblings. One phrase repeated over and over, "It feeds on fear." A loud bang shattered the silence, and the door shook violently as if something massive was trying to force its way in. The girls backed away, clutching each other. From the far corner of the room came a low, guttural growl. They turned to see a patient's bed rising slowly, as if lifted by invisible hands. The mattress collapsed, and standing in its place was the same twisted figure from before. It stood impossibly tall, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its grin wide and filled with jagged teeth. Elena screamed as the figure lunged, its bony fingers outstretched. The flashlight dropped from her hand, and in the chaos, the room was plunged into darkness. She heard Lisa's shrill cries, followed by a deafening silence. When Elena opened her eyes, she was alone. The room was empty, the air still and cold. She scrambled for the flashlight, her hands trembling, and shone it around. There was no sign of Lisa, no sign of the creature, but on the wall, scrawled in fresh blood, were 3 chilling words. "You're next, Elena." Her heart pounding, she stumbled out of the room, desperate to find the others. But the asylum had changed. The hallways no longer led where they should, and the building seemed to pulse, alive and aware of her presence. She screamed for her friends, but only her echoes replied. Eventually, she found Marcus, but he was no longer himself. He stood in the corner of a room, his back to her, muttering incoherently. When she touched his shoulder, he turned, and she gasped in horror. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets, and his face was twisted into a grotesque smile. "They're here," he whispered, his voice unnaturally deep. "And they're hungry." Before she could react, the lights flickered, and dozens of figures emerged from the shadows. They surrounded her, their twisted forms closing in as her screams echoed through the halls of Gravenhurst Sanitarium. When the authorities found the sanitarium weeks later, they discovered no trace of Elena or her friends. The only clue was her flashlight, lying in the center of the main hall, its battery inexplicably still flickering. The storm raged as Clara pulled into the parking lot of St. Dympna's Children's Hospital. The building stood eerily against the backdrop of lightning flashes, its windows dark and lifeless. Once a thriving facility for pediatric care, it had been shuttered for decades after a mysterious outbreak swept through the hospital, claiming the lives of dozens of children and staff. Rumors of strange occurrences had turned it into a local legend, a magnet for thrill seekers and paranormal enthusiasts. Clara wasn't there for thrills. She was an urban photographer, drawn to the decaying beauty of abandoned places. She had heard the stories, phantom children's laughter, shadowy figures, and doors slamming on their own, but dismissed them as local folklore. Tonight, she was determined to capture the haunting beauty of the hospital before it was torn down. She stepped inside, her boots crunching on broken glass. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, a faint, sickly sweet odor that made her stomach turn. The beam of her flashlight swept across the peeling walls, where faded murals of smiling animals and rainbows seemed grotesque in the dim light. The first floor was eerily quiet, save for the distant drip of water echoing through the halls. She began snapping photos, the flash momentarily illuminating the gloom. Her camera lens captured hauntingly beautiful images. A rusted wheelchair overturned in the hallway, a broken IV stand tangled in cobwebs, and a child's teddy bear lying abandoned on the floor. As she ventured deeper, she came across the hospital's playroom. The walls were painted with cheerful scenes of children playing, but the decay had warped their faces, turning smiles into twisted grimaces. The floor was littered with broken toys, and a small rocking horse sat eerily in the corner. Clara raised her camera to take a photo when she heard it, a soft giggle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made her freeze. She swept her flashlight around the room, her pulse quickening. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She convinced herself it was just her imagination. But as she turned to leave, the rocking horse began to sway gently, its creaking filling the room. Clara stumbled back, her breath hitching. There was no draft, no logical explanation. She snapped a photo out of instinct, the flash illuminating the room in a harsh burst of light. When she looked at the display on her camera, her blood ran cold. In the photo, standing behind the rocking horse, was the faint outline of a child. Its face was pale and blurred, its eyes two dark voids staring directly at the lens. Clara's hands shook as she backed out of the playroom, nearly tripping over the debris on the floor. She didn't believe in ghosts, but the unease gnawing at her gut was impossible to ignore. She told herself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the camera. But the further she ventured into the hospital, the worse it got. In the maternity ward, she found rows of decayed cribs, their white paint chipped and stained. One of them swayed slightly as she passed, the motion so subtle she could have dismissed it as her imagination, if not for the faint sound of crying that followed. It was soft, like a newborn's wail, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice echoing down the empty corridor. The crying stopped. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment she was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, she saw them. Tiny handprints smeared across the glass window of the nearest crib. They hadn't been there moments before. Clara turned to run, but the hallway ahead was different. It stretched impossibly far, the walls closing in as if the building were alive and trying to trap her. The storm outside grew louder, the thunder rattling the windows. She stumbled into the stairwell, desperate to get out, but the exit was blocked by debris. Her only option was to go up. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her flashlight's beam bouncing wildly. On the 3rd floor, she found herself in the intensive care unit. The air was colder here, her breath fogging as she exhaled. Monitors and life support machines lay in disrepair, their cords tangled like vines. As she walked, her flashlight caught something written on the wall in large, jagged letters. "Save us." The door at the end of the hallway creaked open slowly, revealing the isolation ward. Inside, she found rows of glass observation rooms, each one holding a small bed surrounded by rotted equipment. The beds were empty, but as she approached, she noticed something horrifying. The glass was covered in tiny fingerprints, smeared as if made by children trying to claw their way out. Her camera felt heavier in her hands as she raised it to take a photo. The flash illuminated the room, and in that brief moment, she saw them. Dozens of children, their gaunt faces pressed against the glass, their hollow eyes watching her. The flash faded, and they were gone. A cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it a whisper. "Stay with us." Clara bolted, her heart pounding as she fled down the hall. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. "Don't leave! Help us! You can't go!" She stumbled into the nurse's station, where a single ledger lay open on the counter. Her flashlight caught the names listed there, names of the children who had died during the outbreak. At the bottom of the page, her own name was scrawled in fresh ink, followed by today's date. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The lights overhead flickered violently, and the air grew suffocatingly heavy. She turned to run, but was stopped by the figure of a nurse standing in the hallway. The woman's face was hidden beneath an old-fashioned cap, but her hands were covered in blood. When she raised her head, Clara saw her eyes, pitch black, void of any humanity. "You shouldn't have come," the nurse said, her voice cold and emotionless. "Now you're one of them." Clara screamed and ran, her mind a blur of terror. She didn't stop until she burst through the front doors of the hospital and into the storm. Rain soaked her as she sprinted to her car, fumbling with the keys. When she finally started the engine, she didn't look back. The next morning, Clara reviewed the photos on her camera. Most of them were too dark or blurred to make out, but the ones she could see made her blood run cold. Every image had the same recurring detail. The shadowy outlines of children, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and anger. Clara deleted the photos and vowed never to speak of what she had seen. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, the soft giggle of a child echoing from the shadows of her room. The sharp scent of formaldehyde still lingered in the air as Alex pushed open the heavy metal doors to what was once Riverview Asylum's morgue. It had been decades since anyone had officially stepped inside the now abandoned institution, but the local legends surrounding its final days were notorious. Riverview, they said, wasn't just a place for the mentally ill. It was a haven for unsanctioned experiments, cruel treatments, and inescapable horrors. Alex wasn't a thrill seeker. He was a documentarian specializing in urban decay, someone who saw beauty in the ruin of forgotten places. But Riverview wasn't like the old theaters or derelict factories he'd explored before. The very walls seemed to hum with tension, as though the building resented his intrusion. The morgue was his first stop. The room was stark and sterile, yet thick with a suffocating presence. The cold metal drawers that once held bodies jutted out like rows of teeth, their handles rusted and stained. The flickering beam of Alex's flashlight swept across the walls, illuminating the faded chalk outlines of numbers above each drawer. He set up his camera tripod in the center of the room, adjusting the lens to capture the grim tableau. As he looked through the viewfinder, he noticed something strange. In the dim light, a smear on one of the drawers appeared to move. He blinked and leaned closer, shining his flashlight on the spot. It wasn't a smear. It was a handprint. Fresh. Alex's breath hitched as he stared at it, his rational mind scrambling for an explanation. Before he could think further, the faint sound of metal groaning echoed behind him. He spun around to see one of the drawers sliding open inch by inch, as if pulled by an unseen hand. "Nope," he muttered, stepping back instinctively. The drawer stopped, halfway open, light revealing darkness inside. Against his better judgment, Alex leaned closer. Just as he peered inside, the temperature in the room plummeted and his flashlight flickered violently. A low, guttural voice whispered from the shadows of the drawer, "Stay with us." Alex staggered back, his camera equipment nearly toppling over. The voice wasn't a trick of the wind or an echo. It felt alive, resonating in his chest like a vibration. He didn't wait to hear it again. Grabbing his camera, he bolted from the morgue, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The asylum's hallways were a maze of crumbling walls and debris. The faint drip of water echoed from somewhere above, the sound uneven and disorienting. As Alex moved deeper into the building, he began to feel as though he was being followed. Every so often, he'd glance over his shoulder, convinced he saw movement, a flicker of shadow, the briefest outline of a figure. He found himself in what had once been the patient wing. The air was heavier here, almost oppressive, and the smell of mildew mixed with an acrid chemical stench. He passed rows of rusted bed frames, some still chained to the floor. A child's shoe lay forgotten in the corner, its sole blackened and worn. The walls were covered in scrawled messages. Some were the ramblings of patients. "They watch me. Voices won't stop. Make it end." But others were warnings, written in larger, more deliberate script. "Don't trust the doctor. The mirrors lie." Alex's flashlight caught a broken shard of a mirror hanging on the far wall. He approached it cautiously, the jagged edges reflecting fractured beams of light. As he stared into the glass, his own reflection began to warp. His face twisted, elongating grotesquely until it wasn't his face at all. The thing in the mirror grinned at him, its mouth impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Get out," Alex hissed to himself, tearing his gaze away. The asylum, however, seemed determined to keep him. As he retraced his steps, he found that the corridors had changed, hallways that should have led to the now twisted and turned unfamiliar wings. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the sound of heavy breathing echoed just behind him. Desperate to find a way out, Alex stumbled into what appeared to be the asylum's operating theater. The room was circular, with tiered seating that loomed like a crowd of silent spectators. In the center stood a rusted operating table, its leather straps still intact. Bloodstains marred the floor, their dark patterns stark against the cracked tiles. As he moved toward the table, he felt the temperature drop again. The air grew so cold it burned his lungs, and his breath came out in thick clouds. Then he heard it, a faint humming like an old lullaby coming from the shadows. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The humming grew louder, more distorted, until it was almost a growl. From the far corner of the room, a figure emerged. It wore the tattered remains of a doctor's coat, but its face was wrong. The eyes were sunken, black voids, and its mouth gaped unnaturally wide, as though unhinged. It dragged a blood-stained scalpel along the wall, the screeching sound piercing Alex's ears. "You're just in time for your procedure," the figure rasped. Alex turned and ran, his camera swinging wildly against his chest. The asylum seemed to close in around him, the walls warping and twisting like a living thing. The distant sound of children crying filled the air, growing louder with each step. He burst into what he thought was the main lobby, but instead, he found himself back in the morgue. The drawers were all open now, their contents spilling onto the floor. Bones, skulls, and decayed remains littered the room, and standing in the center, waiting for him, were the shadows. Dozens of them, their forms flickering and indistinct, but their eyes, empty, soulless pits, glared at him with malice. The voice from before returned, louder this time, echoing from every corner of the room. "You shouldn't have come." The shadows surged toward him, and the world went black. Alex's camera was found 2 weeks later by a group of urban explorers. The footage it contained was fragmented, corrupted by static and strange distortions. But what little could be salvaged showed glimpses of the horrors he had encountered, the twisted reflections, the shadowy figures, and the doctor's chilling smile. No trace of Alex was ever found. The asylum, now surrounded by a razor wire fence, remains untouched. But those brave or foolish enough to peer through its broken windows at night swear they see the flicker of a flashlight and hear the faint click of a camera, followed by a blood-curdling scream. The black silhouette of Hawthorne Asylum loomed against the moonlit sky, its Gothic spires clawing upward like skeletal fingers. Closed for nearly a century, it was a magnet for urban explorers, but its gruesome reputation kept most at bay. The asylum had earned the moniker the House of Screams after reports surfaced of horrific experiments conducted on its patients before a mysterious fire consumed half the building. Tonight, Claire, a history student chasing the perfect thesis subject, braved its crumbling halls. Armed with a flashlight, notebook, and camera, she entered through a side door, its rusted hinges screeching a protest against the silence. As the door shut behind her, a gust of cold air brushed her neck, making her shudder. The asylum's interior was a decaying tomb of forgotten misery. Dust and soot coated the floor, where fragments of medical equipment and broken furniture lay scattered. Faded patient files crumbled at her touch, the ink smudged and illegible. Yet there was something off about the silence. It wasn't empty. It felt aware. Claire started in the East Wing, where patient rooms stood frozen in time. Most were empty, their rusted bed frames bare, but a few still held remnants of their past occupants. A pair of spectacles, a stuffed rabbit missing an ear, a set of restraints bolted to the wall. As she snapped photos, she swore she felt eyes watching her from the shadows, but each time she turned, there was nothing. In the final room of the corridor, she found something stranger. The walls were covered in what appeared to be scratch marks, dozens of them intersecting chaotically. At first, she thought they were just signs of desperation from a patient, but when her flashlight caught the grooves, they formed words, "We're still here." Claire frowned, tracing the scratches with her fingertips. The grooves were deep, almost claw-like. As her hand rested on the wall, she heard it. Faint, distant laughter. Children's laughter. It echoed faintly, bouncing off the walls, though the building had no living souls to make such a sound. She stepped back, heart pounding. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it began, replaced by a long, agonized scream that echoed through the halls. Claire froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound wasn't distant, it was close, far too close. Her flashlight flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before sputtering back to life. She turned, expecting to see something, but the room was as empty as before. "This place is messing with me," she thought, forcing herself to move. She needed to stay calm, or the fear would consume her. Claire made her way to the West Wing, where the experimental treatment rooms were said to be. The air grew colder the deeper she ventured, and the smell of burning wood lingered faintly, a remnant of the fire that had ravaged the building decades ago. She found the hydrotherapy room first. Rusted tubs sat in a row, their peeling paint revealing the corroded metal beneath. Chains hung from the sides, used to bind unwilling patients. One tub still held water, though it was murky and still. As Claire leaned in to inspect it, a ripple spread across the surface. Her flashlight illuminated the water, but there was nothing there. Just as she stepped back, a hand shot up from the depths, its pale, bloated fingers clawing at the edge of the tub. Claire screamed, stumbling backward. When she looked again, the tub was empty. The water was still. Her nerves frayed. Claire decided she had enough of the West Wing, but as she retraced her steps, the layout seemed to change. The hallway she had entered was now a dead end, and a door that had been locked earlier stood ajar, beckoning her. Against her better judgment, she pushed it open. It was the electroshock therapy room. A single gurney sat in the center, its leather straps brittle with age. Wires dangled from the ceiling, their frayed ends swaying slightly despite the still air. The walls were covered in photographs of patients, horribly disfigured faces, eyes filled with despair, mouths frozen in silent screams. A blackboard in the corner bore the words, "One by one." Claire felt a chill crawl up her spine. She didn't want to be in this room, but something compelled her to stay. As she raised her camera to take a photo, she noticed something odd. The gurney had moved. It had been in the center of the room, but now it was several inches closer to her. Her breath quickened as she snapped another photo. This time, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing behind the gurney, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The camera clicked, the flash lit the room, and the figure was gone. The air grew heavier, the room darker. A low whisper began to fill the space, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Claire couldn't make out the words, but the desperation in them was palpable. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut before she reached it. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, clear word, "Stay." The gurney screeched as it dragged itself across the floor toward her. Claire clawed at the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming humanoid shapes that writhed and flickered like flames. Their faces were blank, but their intent was clear. They wanted her. In a final act of desperation, Claire flung her camera at the nearest window. The glass shattered and cold night air flooded the room. She dove through the opening, landing hard on the ground outside. Her hands and knees were scraped raw, but she didn't stop. She ran, the asylum's haunting silhouette fading into the distance behind her. Claire never went back to Hawthorne Asylum, though the memories haunted her for years. When she developed the film from her camera, most of the images were blurred or obscured. But one stood out, a photo of the electroshock therapy room, perfectly clear. In the corner, the shadowy figure stood with its head tilted, staring directly at the camera, and behind it, reflected in a shattered mirror, was Claire herself, only her reflection was smiling. The storm raged mercilessly as David pulled into the gravel driveway of Hollow Pine Sanitarium. The long-abandoned asylum stood at the edge of the woods, shrouded in mist, its windows dark and empty like the hollow eyes of a skull. David was no stranger to urban legends. He was a paranormal investigator who thrived on the thrill of exploring infamous locations. But even he felt a gnawing unease as he stepped out of his car and stared at the crumbling facade. Hollow Pines wasn't just a place where the mentally ill were housed, it was a fortress of horrors. Stories told of brutal staff, experimental lobotomies, and patients who had vanished without a trace. The worst of these tales surrounded Room 103, the death room, where it was said anyone who entered would never leave. David had come prepared. His backpack was filled with high-tech equipment, EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and a digital recorder. But as he stepped through the broken front doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had walked into a trap. The air inside was stale, carrying the metallic tang of rust and decay. The once grand reception hall was a graveyard of shattered furniture and peeling wallpaper. As he set up his equipment, a faint sound echoed through the halls, a soft shuffle like footsteps. David froze, listening. "Hello?" he called, his voice bouncing off the walls. Silence answered, but the faint sound came again, closer this time. He chalked it up to the wind or animals, but his grip on the flashlight tightened. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward as though waiting to swallow him whole. David moved carefully, his footsteps muffled by layers of dust. Each room he passed offered a glimpse into despair. Rusted bed frames chained to the floor, rotted restraints, and crumbling murals of serene landscapes meant to soothe broken minds. Room 103 was at the end of the hall. Its door was different from the others, thicker, with heavy locks and a small viewing window. The glass was cracked, and something dark had smeared the inside. He felt a chill as he stood before it, the air around him colder than it should have been. His hand hovered over the doorknob. "Don't." David spun around, his heart racing. The voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but he was certain he'd heard it. His flashlight revealed nothing but the empty corridor behind him. He shook his head and laughed nervously. "You're psyching yourself out, David?" Ignoring the warning, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room inside was small, barely more than a cell. The walls were covered in scratches, some forming words that were difficult to read. A rusted metal chair sat in the center of the room, its straps dangling like skeletal hands. David set up his camera on a tripod, the lens pointed at the chair. "If there's anyone here, show yourself," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. He set the digital recorder on the floor. "I just want to communicate. Can you give me a sign?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then his EMF detector spiked, its lights flashing wildly. David felt a sudden rush of cold air swirl around him, and the door to room 103 slammed shut with a deafening bang. He ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Okay. Very funny," he muttered, trying to keep his voice light. "Let me out." The temperature in the room dropped further, and David's breath fogged in the air. The scratches on the walls seemed to deepen, as though invisible hands were carving them anew. He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the room, and froze. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it, bound by the decayed straps. It was human-like, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its skin was pale and translucent, the veins beneath forming a map of suffering. Its face was blurred, like an overexposed photograph, but its mouth, wide and filled with impossibly sharp teeth, twisted into a grotesque smile. Who are you?" David stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head further, its neck cracking loudly with the motion. David's recorder picked up a voice, a guttural, raspy whisper. "You came to see." The lights on his camera began to blink erratically, the lens focusing and unfocusing on its own. His EMF detector beeped frantically, its spikes off the charts. The figure in the chair began to rise, its movements jerky, as though it were a marionette pulled by invisible strings. David scrambled backward, his heart pounding. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it on the figure, but it only seemed to grow darker, its blurred edges melting into the shadows. The scratches on the walls now formed a clear message: "Join us." The room's walls began to close in, the shadows swallowing the light. David screamed, slamming his fists against the door. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Just as he thought he would be consumed by the darkness, the door burst open, and David stumbled into the hallway. He didn't stop to look back. Grabbing his gear, he sprinted toward the exit, his only thought to escape. Days later, David reviewed the footage in his home office. Much of it was corrupted, filled with static and strange distortions. But one clip stood out. The camera in room 103 had recorded more than he'd realized. In the video, after David had fled the room, the chair in the center of the frame began to move on its own, its rusted legs screeching against the floor. The figure reappeared, sitting calmly as before. It turned to face the camera, and though its face was still a blur, David could see its smile widen. Then it spoke, in a voice that sent shivers down his spine. "We'll see you again." David never returned to Hollow Pine Sanitarium. But every night, as he tried to sleep, he heard faint whispers in his room. And when he glanced at the corner, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be, he swore he could see the outline of a chair and someone sitting in it, smiling. The lights from Sam's car flickered across the cracked sign as he pulled up to the entrance. Crescent Grove Sanatorium. The massive brick building was barely visible through the tangle of dead vines and overgrown trees, its windows like black, empty eyes. Sam had heard the stories about this place, of patients who had gone mad, of doctors who disappeared, and of the silent nurse, a figure that supposedly still roamed its halls. He wasn't here for ghost stories, though. He was here for proof. Sam was an amateur ghost hunter trying to build his following online. Armed with cameras, a spirit box, and a deep sense of arrogance, he stepped into the abandoned sanatorium, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The entry hall was cavernous, its marble floor cracked and littered with debris. A faint smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. As Sam walked deeper into the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He set up his first camera in what looked like a waiting area, its tattered chairs arranged haphazardly, as if the room had been abandoned in haste. "All right," he said into the camera, his voice steady. "This is where the infamous silent nurse is said to appear. People claim to hear her footsteps and the squeak of her gurney. Let's see if she shows up tonight." He turned on the spirit box, its static buzzing sharply in the quiet room. "Is anyone here with me?" Sam asked. For a moment, the static was all he heard. Then, faintly, a distorted voice broke through. "Leave." Sam grinned. This was exactly what he wanted. "Why should I leave?" he taunted. The spirit box crackled again. This time, The voice was clearer, almost a whisper. "She's coming." Sam's grin faltered. The words were unnerving, but he reminded himself it could just be random noise. He picked up the spirit box and moved further into the sanatorium, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The hallways were lined with doors, most of them ajar, revealing small, empty rooms. The peeling paint and broken furniture gave the place an air of forgotten despair. As he passed one of the doors, he froze. He could swear he'd just heard something. A faint squeak, like wheels rolling on a floor. He whipped his flashlight toward the sound, but the hallway was empty. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. Sam continued deeper into the building, eventually finding what appeared to be an operating room. The rusted operating table sat in the center, its straps still intact. Above it hung a shattered light fixture, swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. The walls were lined with glass cabinets filled with dusty, broken instruments. He set up another camera, angling it to capture the table. "This is where they performed lobotomies and other experiments. Why?" he explained to the camera. "A lot of people died in this room, and some say their spirits are still trapped here." As he turned to leave, the sound came again, the unmistakable squeak of wheels. This time it was closer. Sam's blood ran cold as he turned back toward the hallway. His flashlight beam wavered as he scanned the corridor, but again, there was nothing there. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. Silence. Then from the darkness, a faint but distinct sound. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, accompanied by the rhythmic squeak of something being pushed. Sam backed into the room, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he shouted. A shadow emerged at the end of the hallway. It was tall and humanoid, but its features were obscured by the darkness. The squeaking grew louder as the figure moved closer, and Sam realized it was pushing something. A gurney. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment he saw her, the silent nurse. She was clad in a tattered, blood-stained uniform, her face obscured by a cracked porcelain mask. Her movements were stiff and unnatural, as if she were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The gurney she pushed was rusted and smeared with dark stains. On it lay something covered by a sheet, though it was impossible to tell if it was a body or something else. "Stay back!" Sam yelled, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. The nurse stopped, tilting her head as if studying him. Then she pointed a skeletal hand toward the operating table behind him. Sam turned instinctively, and when he looked back, she was gone. "Jesus," he muttered, his hands shaking. He grabbed his equipment and stumbled out of the room, determined to leave. But the hallway wasn't the same. The layout had changed, twisting into a maze of identical corridors. Every turn he took led him back to the operating room. The spirit box crackled in his bag, and a voice emerged, distorted but clear. "You're mine." Sam felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, but there was no one there. The gurney, however, now sat in the middle of the hallway, empty except for the bloody restraints hanging from its sides. The silent nurse stood behind it, her head tilting in jerky movements as she began to push it toward him. "Stop!" Sam shouted, backing away. The lights on his cameras began to flash wildly, wide out, and the spirit box emitted a series of guttural screams. The nurse didn't stop. Her porcelain mask began to crack, revealing glimpses of rotted flesh beneath. Her voice, low and raspy, broke the air. "Lie down!" Sam turned and ran, his breath ragged. He didn't care about the cameras or the evidence anymore. He just wanted to escape. He burst into the main hall, relieved to see the faint light of his car through the shattered doors. But as he sprinted toward it, the doors slammed shut and the air grew deathly still. The sound of the squeaking gurney filled the room, louder and louder until it was deafening. Sam turned and she was there, standing mere feet away. Her mask shattered completely, revealing a face that was a patchwork of flesh, bone, and darkness. Her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide smile as she whispered, "Your turn." The last thing Sam saw was the gurney rushing toward him. When Sam's friends came looking for him 2 days later, they found his car parked at the entrance, but no sign of him inside the sanatorium. His cameras were discovered in the operating room, the footage corrupted, except for the final recording. It showed Sam standing in the hallway, staring into the camera with wide, terrified eyes. Behind him, the silent nurse loomed, her gurney empty and waiting. The storm rolled in thick and fast as Mia hurried through the woods, the path barely visible beneath the dense canopy of twisted branches. She cursed her curiosity for leading her to Blackridge Asylum, a long-abandoned institution infamous for its brutal history. Local legends claimed the asylum wasn't just haunted but alive, its walls pulsing with the agony of the damned. Mia thought she could handle a ghost hunt, until now. The asylum emerged from the mist like a corpse rising from a grave. Its blackened windows reflected nothing, and its stone walls seemed to drink in the faint moonlight. She pushed open the heavy oak doors, their hinges shrieking like a warning. Inside, the air was damp and cold, thick with the smell of mildew and something coppery that made her stomach turn. The main hall was cavernous, its tiled floor cracked and slick with water dripping from the ceiling. Faded graffiti and smeared handprints covered the walls, and broken wheelchairs lay scattered like forgotten skeletons. Mia's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. "All right, let's get this over with," she whispered to herself, pulling out her phone to record. The red light of the camera blinked on, capturing the decayed grandeur of the asylum's interior. Mia moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing. She passed through the patient wards, where rusted bed frames sat in neat rows, each one bolted to the floor. Personal items, shoes, a doll missing its eyes, crumbling notebooks were left behind as if the patients had vanished overnight. But the thing that unsettled her most were the scratches on the walls. Deep gouges crisscrossed the plaster, some forming words, "Help me. Don't trust her. It watches." Her flashlight caught something in the corner of the room, a wheelchair facing the wall. She hadn't seen it when she entered. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she approached it. The air grew colder, her breath now visible in faint puffs. "Is someone here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The wheelchair moved, just an inch, but enough to make her stumble backward. Her phone's camera caught the motion, and she stared at the screen, hoping she'd imagined it. A low creak echoed through the room, and the wheelchair began to turn slowly, its wheels groaning against the tiled floor. Mia bolted from the room, her heart pounding. She ran down the hall, desperate to put distance between herself and whatever had just happened. The silence of the asylum was deafening, broken only by her ragged breathing. She stopped in what appeared to be a therapy room. A circle of wooden chairs surrounded a small table, its surface scratched and stained. A tape recorder sat in the center, its buttons worn but intact. Curiosity won out over fear, and Mia pressed play. The tape hissed with static before a voice emerged, faint but chilling. "Patient 612 exhibits increasing paranoia, claims the walls are alive, shadows are watching." The voice distorted, breaking into static. Then, in a different, softer tone, another voice spoke. "Don't turn around." Mia froze. The tape clicked off, and the room fell into silence. Her flashlight began to flicker again, and she felt it, the sensation of being watched. Slowly, against every instinct, she turned. At first, she saw nothing. But then, in the corner, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness shifted. It unfurled, stretching upward until it took the shape of a figure, its form barely human. Red pinpricks glowed where eyes should have been, and its mouth, jagged and impossibly wide, opened in a silent scream. Mia ran, her phone slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. She didn't stop to retrieve it. The hallways seemed to twist and change as she fled, each turn leading her deeper into the asylum instead of toward the exit. The whispers began then, soft and overlapping, like dozens of voices trying to speak all at once. "Stay with us. Don't leave. She's waiting." Mia burst into what looked like a surgical ward. The smell of rot and antiseptic hit her like a wave, and she gagged. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered across steel trays, and a single operating table sat in the center of the room, its leather straps broken. The whispers grew louder, their words indistinct but filled with malice. Then the lights flickered, and she saw them, figures standing around the operating table. They were translucent, their faces blurred as if they were smeared on glass. They turned to look at her in unison, their heads tilting in jerky, unnatural movements. Mia backed away, but the door slammed shut behind her. The figures began to move closer, their feet not touching the ground. She felt her body seize with fear as the room grew darker, the figures now little more than shifting shadows. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single guttural voice that filled the room. "Lie down." The operating table creaked, its straps slithering like snakes as they uncoiled and reached toward her. Mia screamed, clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The straps wrapped around her wrists, pulling her toward the table. Then, Just as she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, the door flew open and she stumbled into the hallway. She didn't stop running, her legs burning as she pushed herself toward the faint outline of the entrance. The asylum seemed to groan in protest as she escaped, its walls echoing with a sound that was almost a growl. Mia didn't stop until she was in her car, the engine roaring to life. She sped away, the asylum disappearing into the storm behind her. She swore she would never return. The next morning, she found her phone sitting on the passenger seat, though she was sure she had dropped it inside the asylum. When she played the footage, her stomach churned. The video showed her running down the halls, but something was following her. A dark, shifting mass that seemed to stretch toward her like grasping hands. The last clip was the worst. It showed her standing in the surgical ward, staring blankly into the camera. Behind her, the shadowy figure loomed, its red eyes glowing, and in a voice that was unmistakably her own, she whispered, "I'll be back." Mia threw the phone into a river that same day, but she could still feel the asylum's pull every time she closed her eyes. And at night, when the shadows grew long in her room, she swore she could hear the whispers calling her name. The rain lashed against the windows of St. Dymphna's Hospital, a decrepit structure long abandoned on the outskirts of town. Once a bustling facility, it had been shuttered for decades after a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances. Locals spoke in hushed tones about its dark past, a place where the screams of patients echoed long after they were gone. Now it stood as a crumbling monument to despair, surrounded by wild, tangled undergrowth and shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the whispers of the wind. Emily, a journalist with a penchant for the macabre, stood at the gates, gripping her flashlight. This was her assignment, an exposé on haunted locations. Her skeptical editor had scoffed at her enthusiasm for the supernatural, but Emily knew there was something here. She had spent weeks researching St. Dymphna's, uncovering a history steeped in agony. There were tales of Dr. Hensley, the hospital's lead psychiatrist, whose experiments on patients were described as inhumane and monstrous. The rumors spoke of surgeries without anesthesia and sessions that pushed the mind to the brink of madness. One night, Hensley vanished, leaving behind a blood-soaked office. His disappearance marked the beginning of the hospital's downfall. Determined, Emily pushed open the creaking gate, the sound slicing through the night like a scream. She crossed the overgrown courtyard and reached the front doors, their wood warped and splintered with age. With a deep breath, she stepped inside. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Her flashlight illuminated the peeling walls, graffiti scrawled in languages she didn't understand, and rusted gurneys left to rot. The first floor was eerily quiet, save for the drip of water from somewhere unseen. Emily's footsteps echoed as she ventured down the main corridor, her every nerve on edge. She paused at the reception desk, its surface littered with old paperwork, yellowed and curling with time. She picked up a patient file and scanned the name, Margaret Duval, committed in 1958 for hysterical delusions. The notes ended abruptly, as if someone had been interrupted mid-sentence. Emily shuddered and set the file down, her fingers brushing against something sticky. She lifted her hand to see a dark, viscous substance smeared across her skin. Blood? No. It couldn't be. It was too fresh. A sudden clatter made her spin around, the flashlight beam jittering across the walls. A wheelchair, which had been motionless seconds ago, rolled slowly across the hallway. Emily's heart thundered in her chest as she backed away. She told herself it was the wind, though there was no draft strong enough to move such a heavy object. She pressed on, heading toward the stairs. The second floor housed the psychiatric wing, the epicenter of St. Dymphna's dark history. As Emily ascended, the air grew colder, each breath visible as a white puff. The hallway here was narrower, lined with rooms that had once held the hospital's most troubled patients. The doors were heavy, reinforced with iron bars, many of them scratched and dented from the inside. Emily peered into one of the cells, her flashlight revealing a small, bare space. Chains dangled from the wall, their metal corroded but unmistakably sinister. A faint sound caught her attention, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She turned, the beam of light trembling as she scanned the corridor. There was nothing there, yet the sound persisted, growing louder and more anguished. Emily clenched her fists, forcing herself to move forward. This was her story. She wouldn't turn back now. The moaning led her to a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, revealing what appeared to be an operating theater. The room was in shambles, surgical instruments scattered across the floor, their edges dulled with rust. A gurney stood in the center, its leather straps still intact. Emily's stomach churned as she imagined what had happened here. She stepped closer, her flashlight landing on a dark stain that spread across the floor beneath the gurney. Blood, dried and blackened with age. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Emily whipped around, her breath hitching in her throat. She lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as she pounded on the door, shouting for help. Then the temperature plummeted further, and a shadow began to take shape in the corner of the room. It was a figure, indistinct and shrouded in darkness, but its presence was suffocating. Emily's flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the oppressive gloom. The shadow moved, its form becoming clearer. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing a blood-stained lab coat. His face was obscured, but Emily knew who it was, Dr. Hensley. The room filled with an overwhelming sense of dread as he stepped closer, his footsteps silent. Emily stumbled back, her legs hitting the gurney. The straps seemed to writhe, snaking toward her like living things. She screamed, thrashing as the leather bands wrapped around her wrists and ankles, pulling her down onto the cold metal. Hensley loomed over her, his hand reaching out. It was skeletal, the flesh stretched tight over bone, fingers tipped with claws. He placed his hand on her forehead and an icy pain shot through her skull. Images flooded her mind, patients screaming, their eyes wide with terror as they were strapped to this very gurney. She saw their suffering, their minds unraveling under Hensley's merciless gaze. Then she felt it, an unbearable pressure as if her own thoughts were being pulled apart. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily yanked her arm free and grabbed her flashlight, swinging it wildly. The beam struck Hensley's face, and for a brief moment she saw it clearly. His eyes were hollow sockets, his mouth a gaping void from which a chorus of tortured screams erupted. The light seemed to repel him, and he recoiled, his form dissipating into the shadows. The straps released her, and Emily scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She threw herself at the door, this time finding it open. She bolted down the hall, her breaths ragged and her vision blurred by tears. The moans and screams followed her, echoing through the building. She didn't stop until she reached the front doors, bursting out into the rain-soaked night. As she fled across the courtyard, she glanced back at the hospital. In the uppermost window, she saw him, Dr. Hensley, staring down at her, his hollow eyes burning with malevolent intent. Emily didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, the hospital shrinking in her rearview mirror. For weeks afterward, Emily was haunted by nightmares. She tried to write her article, but the words wouldn't come. Every time she sat down to type, her mind was flooded with the faces of the patients she had seen in her vision. She began to notice strange things, a shadow that lingered too long in the corner of her room, the sound of distant whispers when she was alone. One night, she awoke to find the word "come back" scrawled across her bedroom wall in dark, dripping letters. Emily never returned to St. Dymphna's, but she knew it wasn't over. The hospital had marked her, claimed a piece of her soul, and deep down, she feared the day she would be compelled to go back, drawn by the same darkness that had consumed so many before her.